On the night of March 31st, 1922, 6 people vanished from an isolated farm in southern Germany. Days later, neighbors entered the property expecting to find a family going about their usual work. Instead, they discovered one of the most horrifying crime scenes in German history. Whoever committed the murders didn't simply disappear. According to investigators, the killer appeared to remain on the farm for days afterward, feeding the livestock, eating meals inside the house, and moving freely through the property as if nothing had happened. More than 100 years later, despite thousands of suspects, countless theories, and one of the largest investigations of its time, nobody has ever been convicted. This is the story of the Hinterkaifeck murders. About 70 kilometers north of Munich stood a small, isolated farm known as Hinterkaifeck. Surrounded by fields and dense woodland, the property sat far enough away from neighboring homes that visitors were uncommon, and help was never close by. It was here that the Gruber family lived. The head of the household was 63-year-old Andreas Gruber, and his wife, 72-year-old Cäzilia. Living alongside them was their widowed daughter, Viktoria Gabriel, and her 2 children, 7-year-old Cäzilia and 2-year-old Joseph. Like most farming families of the time, their lives revolved around work. Before sunrise, they cared for livestock, maintained the buildings, and spent long hours tending the land. Days were physically demanding, but life followed a familiar rhythm. To outsiders, Hinterkaifeck appeared ordinary, a quiet family, living a quiet life on a quiet farm. But months before the murders, strange events had already begun unfolding around the property. The first warning came from someone who knew the farm better than almost anyone else. For years, the Grubers employed a maid to help with the endless workload. Then, without warning, she resigned. Her reason sounded unbelievable. She claimed she repeatedly heard footsteps coming from the attic. Sometimes, voices. Other times, sounds she couldn't explain. Convinced the farm was haunted, she collected her final wages and never returned. The Grubers dismissed her concerns. Whether the noises had a simple explanation or something far more sinister, nobody could say. Life continued as normal. Eventually, the family hired a replacement. The Gruber family had lived at Hinterkaifeck for years. Their days followed the same routine. Before sunrise, the family would head into the barn to feed the livestock. Hours were spent repairing fences, tending the fields, and maintaining the property. By the time the sun disappeared behind the Bavarian countryside, exhaustion had become part of daily life. Nothing about their routine suggested that within days, every member of the household would be dead. Running a farm of that size wasn't easy. The workload was relentless, and with only 5 adults and 2 young children, every extra pair of hands mattered. Months earlier, the family's longtime maid had unexpectedly resigned after claiming she could no longer stay on the property. The Grubers dismissed her fears as superstition. The maid packed her belongings, collected her wages, and never returned. For nearly 6 months, the family managed without help. Then, on the afternoon of March 31st, 1922, a new maid finally arrived. Her name was Maria Baumgartner. Accompanied by her sister, she was introduced to the family and shown around the farm. After a brief visit, her sister said goodbye and began the journey home, leaving Maria behind to start what everyone believed would be an ordinary new job. But while Maria was settling into her new home, strange things had already begun happening around Hinterkaifeck. Days earlier, Andreas Gruber noticed something unusual outside the property. Fresh footprints stretched across the snow from a nearby forest directly toward the farm. Curious, he followed them as far as the buildings. What troubled him wasn't where the tracks began, it was where they ended. He couldn't find a single trail leading back into the forest. At first, Andreas assumed someone had wandered onto the property, but over the following days, more unsettling discoveries followed. A key to the farmhouse went missing without explanation. A newspaper appeared that no one in the family subscribed to. Andreas also discovered signs that someone had tampered with a lock leading into one of the farm buildings. Individually, none of these events seemed impossible to explain. Together, however, they painted a picture that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Neighbors encouraged Andreas to report the incidents. Some even offered to help search the property. He refused. Whether he believed the events were harmless or whether he suspected something else entirely remains unknown. Life on the farm continued. At least, that's how it appeared from the outside. Within 24 hours of Maria Baumgartner arriving at Hinterkaifeck, every person on the farm, including Maria herself, would be dead. But nobody knew it yet, and the first signs that something had gone terribly wrong wouldn't appear until several days later. On April 1st, a pair of coffee merchants made their usual visit to the farm. They had stopped there many times before to collect orders from the Gruber family, but this visit felt different. They knocked on the farmhouse door and waited. No one answered. Assuming the family was busy working somewhere on the property, the merchants called out a few more times before giving up. As they walked away, they noticed one small detail. The gate leading toward the machine house stood open. It wasn't enough to raise alarm, but it was unusual. The following day, another sign appeared. 7-year-old Cäzilia Gruber never arrived for school. Teachers assumed she was sick. Children missed school from time to time, and no one thought much of it. Then came Sunday. For years, attending church had been part of the Gruber family's routine, but that morning, their usual seats remained empty. Friends noticed. Neighbors noticed. Still, nobody imagined the truth. As Monday passed without a single sighting of anyone from Hinterkaifeck, concern slowly turned into worry. The family hadn't spoken to neighbors, nobody had seen them working in the fields, no smoke had been seen rising from the chimney. It was as if the entire farm had simply stopped. By the afternoon of April 4th, several neighbors decided they could no longer ignore the silence. Together they made their way toward Hinterkaifeck. The closer they came, the more unusual everything seemed. The livestock could be heard inside the barn, but there wasn't a single person in sight. They called out for Andreas, for Viktoria, for anyone. Nothing. One of the neighbors stepped through the open gate and cautiously entered the barn. The others followed close behind. For a few moments, nobody spoke. Then came a scream. Lying inside the barn were the bodies of Andreas Gruber, his wife Cäzilia, their daughter Viktoria, and young Cäzilia. Each had suffered devastating injuries. Whoever had attacked them had done so with extraordinary violence. At first, the neighbors believed they had found everyone, but 2 people were still missing. The family's new maid, Maria Baumgartner, and 2-year-old Joseph. They rushed toward the farmhouse, hoping, perhaps irrationally, that the 2 had somehow survived. Instead, they uncovered an even darker scene. Inside the house lay Maria. Not far away, little Joseph. 6 people had been murdered. No witnesses, no obvious suspect, no clear explanation. One of Germany's greatest unsolved mysteries had just begun. Within hours, word of the murders had spread across the surrounding villages. What investigators found at Hinterkaifeck would challenge almost everything they expected from a murder scene. Detectives began by examining the barn, where 4 members of the Gruber family had been discovered. The victims hadn't been scattered across the property. Instead, they appeared to have been killed one after another in the same location. This raised an unsettling possibility. Had someone lured them into the barn one at a time? If that was true, it meant the killer had remained calm throughout the entire attack. There were no signs of a frantic struggle spreading across the farm. Whoever was responsible seemed to know exactly what they were doing. Inside the farmhouse, investigators found Maria Baumgartner in her bedroom. She had been on the property for less than a day. The job she had accepted that morning would become the last day of her life. But the murders themselves weren't the only mystery. The condition of the farm suggested something impossible. The livestock were alive and had been fed. Fresh food appeared to have been prepared inside the kitchen. The fireplace showed signs of recent use. Nothing indicated the property had been abandoned immediately after the murders. If investigators were correct, someone had remained at Hinterkaifeck after every member of the family was dead, for hours, perhaps even days. There was no evidence that large amounts of money had been stolen. Valuable belongings were still inside the farmhouse. If robbery had been the motive, why leave them behind? Investigators searched every room, every building, and every inch of the surrounding land. They interviewed neighbors, travelers, workers, and anyone who might have passed near the farm in the days before the murders. Each interview added another piece to the puzzle, but none of them completed it. Several witnesses recalled seeing unfamiliar people near Hinterkaifeck in the weeks leading up to the killings. Others remembered Andreas Gruber speaking about strange footprints leading to the farm. Some mentioned missing keys. Others remembered the mysterious newspaper that nobody in the household admitted bringing home. Individually, each clue seemed insignificant. Together, they painted a chilling picture. Someone may have been watching the farm, long before the murders ever took place. As investigators dug deeper into the Gruber family's lives, attention slowly shifted away from the crime scene and toward the people who might have wanted the family dead. In the weeks that followed, investigators were overwhelmed with tips. Some came from neighbors, others from complete strangers. Rumors spread faster than facts, and before long, almost everyone connected to Hinterkaifeck had become a suspect in someone's eyes. But as detectives worked through each lead, one question remained at the center of the investigation. Who knew the farm well enough to move through it in complete darkness? The first theory. One of the earliest theories was that the killer wasn't a stranger at all, but someone the family already knew. There were no signs that the victims had barricaded themselves inside the house or attempted to flee before the attacks. If investigators were correct that the victims had entered the barn one by one, it's possible they had no reason to fear the person waiting for them. That possibility immediately shifted attention toward the family's personal relationships, and few members of the household attracted more speculation than Andreas Gruber himself. Andreas Gruber. By many accounts, Andreas was known as a difficult man. Neighbors described him as stubborn, argumentative, and often involved in disputes. Over the years, he had made enemies within the local community, but making enemies wasn't enough to prove murder. Investigators explored whether an old grudge might have turned violent. Yet, despite numerous interviews, no evidence directly connected any of Andreas's known rivals to the crime scene. Then, investigators considered another possibility. What if the motive wasn't revenge, but something much closer to home? Attention turned toward Viktoria Gabriel's personal life. Following the death of her husband during the First World War, she remained on the family farm, raising her children alongside her parents. Over time, rumors about family tensions and personal relationships spread throughout the village. Some investigators wondered whether those conflicts could somehow be connected to the murders. But rumors, no matter how persistent, are not evidence. And once again, detectives found nothing that could conclusively identify a killer. As the investigation stalled, another theory began gaining support. Perhaps the murderer had never lived in the village at all. Investigators revisited the strange events reported before the murders. The unexplained footprints leading toward the farm, the missing key, the unfamiliar newspaper, the sounds reported in the attic. Viewed separately, each incident seemed ordinary. Viewed together, they suggested something far more unsettling. Could someone have been secretly living on or near the property for days before the attack, watching the family, learning their routines, waiting for the right moment to strike? It was a terrifying possibility, but investigators couldn't prove it. No witness ever identified such a person. No physical evidence confirmed that anyone had been hiding on the property before the murders. The theory remained exactly that, a theory. As decades passed, witnesses grew older. Many died before the mystery could ever be solved. Physical evidence that might have identified the killer was lost to time. Techniques that investigators rely on today simply didn't exist in 1922. With every passing year, the chances of finding definitive answers became smaller. And yet, the questions never did. Who left the footprints leading toward the farm, but never back into the forest? Why did the previous maid flee after reporting strange noises inside the house? Who brought the unfamiliar newspaper onto the property? And if someone truly remained at Hinterkaifeck after the murders, what were they doing there? Even today, historians continue debating those same questions. Some believe the answer lies in someone the family already knew. Others believe the killer was an outsider who carefully planned every step. After more than a century, no single theory explains every piece of evidence. Perhaps that's why the Hinterkaifeck murders continue to fascinate people around the world. It's not simply because 6 innocent lives were taken. It's because the case leaves behind a trail of clues that seem to point in every direction, yet nowhere at all. An isolated farm, a family that never saw the danger coming, a killer who disappeared without a trace, and a mystery that has now remained unsolved for more than 100 years. Maybe one day, someone will finally connect the pieces investigators couldn't. Until then, Hinterkaifeck remains one of history's most chilling, unsolved murder cases.